Try that. Karl,
Yes,
let's look at the possibilities of Big 12 expansion. And before we get into whether they go to this school, that school, or the other school, Karl, or 10 or 12, let's just take you and put you in Bowlesby's seat and talk about what would be important and why would they want to expand and why wouldn't they just want to stay with the new Big 8?
I think that point right there of staying at 8, I think it is a reasonable option. The old Big 8 conference that included, a majority of those 8 schools, minus Baylor, Texas Tech, and TCU in Virginia. I guess there's 4 of them that were members of the Big 8 for many, many, many years and operated as an 8-team league, even in the early days of the BCS, in the early days of the Alliance. And so I think that is something that they have to consider. The issue of television revenue or just revenues in general, and dividing the pie by 8 versus dividing it by 10 or 12 or 14. I'm sure that they're running all those numbers. And, I think the one of the good things about the Big 12 is that they've got a lot of schools that want to join, despite what what the American wants to do. I think that it has been clear that there are schools who still would think that the Big 12 as a member, of the NCAA Autonomy 5 and the CFP Group of 5 or Power 5, that there's value, that the Big 12 still has name value and credibility value that makes them attractive to American schools, Mountain West schools. I'm sure that the same group of schools that lined up 10 deep back in 2016 or whenever it was, Jeff, those same schools have been lining up here in the last 2 weeks.
So if they were to only expand by a few or not expand at all, Karl, they could, if they stayed at 8, they'd have to schedule 5 non-conference games, each one of them. Of course, if they bumped it up to 10, then it gets a little bit better, right? In terms of how many they'd have to schedule, only a couple. If you get it to 12, it gets even potentially probably staying at that number, right? There's a point where 3 seems to be a manageable non-conference number. Maybe in the case of the Big 12, they go to 4. But with the Alliance now, Karl, do you think this muddies the water in who they're going to be able to schedule? The SEC almost seems off limits, and this new Alliance may make it more difficult to get non-conference games. Do you think that's realistic, and how has that changed things?
I think that is real, and that one of the benefits of going to 10 teams or 12 teams is that it creates 1 or 2 more conference games. It guarantees a home game in there, and it takes the pressure of having to go out and find those non-conference opponents. And I think that if the trend is by the Alliance and the trend by the SEC is by increasing the number of games played against each other versus the Group of 5 or FCS, and if the trend is going to how many games can you play against each other, then this would allow the Big 12 to kind of maintain that trend and not be put at a disadvantage when it comes to the playoff, whether it's a 4-team or if it ends up going to the 12-team playoffs. So I think regular season scheduling, I think will indeed be more among the group, the club, the elite club of those 5 conferences. And there'll be an occasional, Boise State will be an attractive team. San Diego State will be an attractive team. Obviously, the American teams, and if the assumption is that the American loses some of their more attractive, they still have a couple more. So Um, I think the Big 12 is, is that they're in a good position in terms of options and choices.
So by looking at their situation, we identify they're going to go to at least 2 or 4 more schools. And you start saying, okay, we got all this money coming in from Texas and Oklahoma, Karl, because we're going to stay and they're going to stay, or we'll let them buy themselves out perhaps, but we're going to get as much of their money as we can through 25. Our deal with ESPN and Fox needs to be renegotiated. Are there consultants or people in between that can tell them, hey, you add this school, that school, the other school, here's what we think it's worth? Is that how they figure it out? Because they can't just put their finger to the wind.
No, they actually have. There are consultants that have the analysis and what and BYU is a good example. Mm-hmm. People already know how much ESPN values BYU in terms of an independent. So there's a starting point that if they were to take BYU already has an established value of, I don't know, $5, $6, $7, $8 million, and so they know
nothing,
that,
right?
Yeah, I mean it's
not a lot of dough.
No, it isn't. It's a pretty small number and has been. So I don't know if that if that increases. I think that again the value of the games that if they were just hypothetically, if they were to take BYU and all of a sudden BYU now is playing the 8 Big 12 teams, all 8 of those games would seem to be valuable, marketable games that that ESPN would look at, or some other Fox could look at and determine what the price per game value might even be, Jeff.
Wow. Well, it's not that encouraging for Boise State. We're looking at another 4 or 5 million maybe, and that's not a lot of money to those networks. They can make that back quite easily versus what each school would take away from the Big 12. But when we start looking now specifically at schools, Karl, it's got to be, we're going to expand. Let's just suggest we're in the Big 12 shoes. We're going to expand because we got to solidify our non-conference games. That's way too many. We need to start building up some of these partnerships. And you look at these schools that are available, you have to have a list of priorities, don't you? Like, what's the most important thing to us? And as a former conference commissioner, what would you guess is on that list? Because TV households is maybe older thinking, Karl. It's more about streams and your IP address off your computer. It's not as much about just potential in households.
It isn't, and yet there's still, I think there's still value in a collective group of members. And again, all the writing and all the chatter and all the discussion that that the Big 12, obviously they can't replace Oklahoma and Texas. That it's impossible unless they were to go out and get Notre Dame, and and we know that isn't going to happen. So at the very beginning, they know that they took a big hit, as much as 50% is what's being reported. How much of that can they get back by adding Central Florida, BYU, or Cincinnati, or Houston, or Boise State? And I think that they can, they can have consultants that can tell them pretty clear that you add these 4 schools and you're going to add 15% of it back or 20% of it back. And then it's just a simple calculation there. Is that worth it? Is that worth it on the financial piece? But then we go back into, as we've talked before, about what are the other benefits. There's some scheduling benefits that are there. If this conference, assuming that West Virginia stays in the conference, mm-hmm. It's and they're on an island out there. How do they create some scheduling models for their other sports, their men's and women's basketball, their volleyball, some of their team sports? And that's where, do you go to 12 so you can create some divisions and to create some better scheduling models that reduce the travel, and not necessarily the cost of travel, but at a time when I think when student athlete, welfare, health and welfare is a possibility, is a concern. How many days away from campus from academic standpoint, and can two divisions, and I was always a proponent of two divisions. If you have a big footprint, if your footprint is big,
they would,
and they would be a big footprint,
yes,
then can you create two divisions that kind of mitigates that, that oversized footprint?
Well, I looked at this footprint, Carl. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that you're looking at Cincinnati and Central Florida and Houston and BYU coming in the West. So those four schools into the Big 12. And I looked at, okay, now Cincinnati and West Virginia makes some sense. You'd have to put Central Florida in the eastern part of the Big 12. You may punish Houston. Say, all right, you're coming in late. You're going to have to stay in the East as well. That would be 4. And then the scramble would start of the existing schools that are really, when you look at it, the Big 12's got a nice I formation in the middle of our country. And, do they take Iowa State and send them over there, and which one of the Texas schools, how would you do that? That becomes a little complicated, but I would think from a balancing geography perspective, Cincinnati fits in well with West Virginia. The distance, Carl, between Provo and Central Florida is almost the same as California and Hawaii. So that's brutal.
And then, and Miami, Central Florida to Ames, Iowa. And Morgantown to Provo. Those are the 4 schools on the 4 corners, so to speak. Would be Central Florida and West Virginia, and Ames to the north, and BYU to the west. So
yeah,
it's not a footprint that that is an easy one to navigate in terms of football. Is, we've said this many times. It doesn't make any difference about football. Right. You get on an airplane, and and there'll be some bus trips there, between Lubbock and Waco, and if you throw in Houston,
sure. Baylor and TCU, easy,
yeah, sure. But once you get out of the state of Texas, then everybody's jumping on an airplane. But it's there's concern about what does conference membership and the footprint do to some of these other sports.
Yeah. What about, Carl? Back to football for a second, and this is a controversial piece for some, but can you identify the motivations for Texas Tech and Baylor and TCU to want Houston to come in? Is it because of their law school, med school, Research One status? Is that really important to them? The recruiting territory they can already tap, or are they fighting it? And it's the other 5 that are saying, look, guys, they're the Pac-12 loves them. We should too. How does that work?
Yeah, it's there's always been this resistance within a region, or more specifically within a state, of diluting a particular state, or diluting a recruiting area, or there's just academic arrogance that exists, that the University of Houston has grown significantly academically, and they've added academic credibility and academics status, just like Boise State has. Yeah. We go back in time to the WAC when I was trying to fill out the WAC after I was left with 8 schools, and the first 2 schools that I brought to the presidents and chancellors of this 8-team WAC is I recommended that we added Nevada and Boise State. This was 1999, Jeff. Wow. And they both made their presentations, and I came back into the room and they said, we're unanimous in adding Nevada. It's got a law school. It's a land grant. We think it'd be a great addition to the WAC. But your alma mater just doesn't cut it academically.
Did they tell you that?
Absolutely.
Your alma mater, Carl.
Yeah, they made it very clear that that my alma mater was not going to make the cut line, and so the first go around, Boise State doesn't get the invite. 6 months later, TCU leaves that that WAC group at that time.
Sure.
And we need another school. And second go around, they take Boise State. But so there's always, there's some history in terms of the University of Houston, in the state of Texas that is longstanding. But I don't know. Again, there's conferences when they're desperate, and I don't mean to say that the Big 12 is in a desperate situation, because they could stay at 8.
Sure.
So they do have some choices. But when conferences are desperate, schools tend to look a little bit better than they did before a crisis or before desperation sets in. So Houston, I think, is kind of in that. Do we really need Houston?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
is there somebody else that
Boise State? What if it's Boise
teams?
State or Houston? What if it's Boise? What are the negatives and positives in 21 and beyond for Boise State, Karl? Why aren't they in this conversation, really, for people who know people close to the situation? Their name's not coming up much.
Yeah, good. I think that's a really good question. And whether or not it's, has Boise State lost some of that luster in the last, 2 or 3 or 4 years for whatever reasons. And that they're not automatically on that top rung like they may have been 5 years ago. Has Houston gotten better? Has Cincinnati gotten better? Has University of Central Florida gotten better? They may not have gotten any better, but they sure have gotten a lot more publicity than Boise State has gotten in the last 5 years. And so do they just look better and sound better than Boise State? At one time they just didn't have there wasn't that competition, that Boise State was the dominant group of 5. And you and I've talked about this before. Mike Oresco has done a great job of promoting his conference and his teams in on the national stage, and they've backed it up.
So maybe they've gotten out promoted, plus they have not won or gotten into now New Year's Day 6 bowl games since 14. You could argue they're still ahead of Houston, and because Boise State's won championships, Houston's won 1, I think. Central Florida, you could say, has done as well or better. Cincinnati, in the last 3 or 4 years, as well or better. BYU, enough said. I think everybody knows they're the 100-pound, 900-pound gorilla in the room, and they've got a lot of things going for them.
But how many times has BYU been passed over? Numerous times.
Right.
And again, there are reasons, and there are academic reasons, there are cultural reasons, there are social issue reasons, and I think that whatever baggage BYU has had in the past, it's not as if it's gone away. It's whether or not the powers to be in the remaining Big 12 are at a point where they want to overlook some of those warts. So to speak.
Those warts for Boise State, Karl, back to them. I mean, okay, they don't have the shine, the buzz, the PR, the little engine that could, because they've blown some games. The Washington game, they lost to San Jose. They didn't go to a bowl game. They got lightning striked out of a Boston College game. They got blown out to Oklahoma State. Yeah, they had a win against Florida State. They got blown out by BYU. These are recent events that I think have changed that. What else is there? It's not a big TV market. We know that.
But I don't think that's important today. I think that again, how does ESPN value, Boise State versus Cincinnati versus Houston versus Central Florida?
They like them. They want to pay them more than the rest of the Mountain West, but not more than the AAC.
Right. So if not to create the conspiracy and the collusion, the Big 12 off the record, asks ESPN, which of these schools, do you think we ought to take? And again, that's delicate,
sure.
that's a delicate question. Right.
Down the road. Yeah.
I mean, what do they say? What does ESPN say today? 5 years ago, they may have said Boise State is still the glamour and the glitz and the glamour, and it's still turning, it's still turning TVs on, and it's still delivering, you know, advertising revenue that the others,
Yeah. They
aren't.
may want them where they are, Carl. I mean, think of the Mountain West without them.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, ESPN may be going, well, do we really need them over here in the Big 12 with those schools? Maybe not. They're not going to push the dial that much. But without them in the Mountain West, that West Coast market that likes to watch those Boise State football games that are late, that San Diego, Seattle, San Francisco, LA,
Right.
that corridor, which is so important to ESPN. I think they know Boise State's a great late night act, and that's important to them. But where they put them, perhaps. But what about?
Well, and remember
remember
too, in terms of that, the Boise State value, Boise State, was the Friday night franchise
right
for ESPN during that era, during that
Yeah.
period of time. And I mean, that's where Boise State got its, we can say that January 1,
That's a
2007
good point.
in
Yeah.
Glendale,
Yeah.
was the launching pad. But it was that period after the Oklahoma win when Boise State really became a weekly, piece of ESPN programming. And, and they, that's,
Good point.
that has disappeared.
That's a good point. Yeah. And maybe they move them back there. Lastly, let's just say it is the configuration we mentioned with BYU coming in the West, and then the rest of them, Houston, Central Florida, and Cincinnati. So that's the new Big 12. 3 of those teams come from the AAC, Carl. Mike Oresco wanted to make them a Power 6. That would really hurt his cause. Does this create the next domino? Does he start airlifting teams out of the Sun Belt or Conference USA? What's his move?
Well, good question, and one that he's trying not to have to face that, but at some point in time, reality sets in, and is as the momentum gains on this Big 12, adding 4 schools, and of which 3 would name whatever 3 they may be are coming out of the American. It does put Mike in a position to, okay, what's next? What's next for the American? And he'll have options. I mean, there will be schools lined up from Conference USA, from the Mid-American, from the Sun Belt that that will want and gladly make the move to the American, probably just for the same reason that the American schools are going to view the Big 12. The American right now is clearly above the others. But I think one of the important pieces here, again, it's all speculative right now. If Houston is one of them, the American has just moved their offices to Texas, and it's now a Texas-based conference.
Right.
And how do they move forward?
Yeah.
Well, SMU is still part of that, and would be, and you still have the Tulsas and Memphis in the in the West, but it definitely impacts we talk about footprints. It definitely would impact their footprint.
Well, Carl, we got, who knows, a lot of time to figure this all out, or maybe they make a quick move. At this point, nobody probably knows, but 2025 is when those contracts are up and the big Texas Oklahoma payments come in. It's always good. Thanks for coming aboard and giving us some more X's and O's, Carl. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks, Jeff.